Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the RUCKCast. My name's Jim Palmer, and today I want to talk about something that um, I've kind of been championing lately. Um, and if you're wondering what I've been championing, my whole thing lately has been doing more with less. I'll tell you a story, and then we'll get into the whole meat and potatoes of today's episode. I was I was working on a design, and I had done the APs. I put all the APs where I needed them to go, and I had my access layer switches, and then I had an aggregation switch. And I was talking to the salesperson, and they were like, "Well, don't you need an ag switch, an aggregation switch?" And I said, "Well, I do." I said, that's that fiber switch that's down there at the bottom of the BOM list, the bill of materials." I said, "There's that fiber switch down there, and on all of the optics." I said, "That is my ag switch." And they said, "Well, that's not an ag switch." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you need like a really powerful switch. You need like a big switch. You need like this really high end switch." And I asked them. I said, well, what are we using this network for? And they're like, "Oh, it's a guest network." And I said, "So it's all going to the internet?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what's the size of the circuit?" And he said, "Well, 10 gigabits per second." And I said, "Okay." So I said, "This network's never going to get more than 10 gig." Um, I was like, "So why do I need to have an aggregation switch that can do over 1 terabyte per second?" I was like, on a 10 gig circuit. If we're sort of gauging everything on this 10 gig circuit, I was like, do I really need to have 1 terabyte? Do I need 1,000 uh, gigabits per second? When I'm limited to 10? I was like, or I was like, hear me out. I said, couldn't I just use like something that does 500 gigabits per second, for a 10 gig circuit? And he was like, "Well, yeah, I guess you really wouldn't need a terabyte if all you're doing is 10 gig." And I said, "Exactly." And I said, "Now I'm more than happy to sell it if they want to pay for, a switch that they're never going to really use." I was like, "I have no problem selling it." I was like, "But they don't really need it." And it got us kind of off on a tangent. And that's the tangent that I want to talk about today, is doing more with less. Because I feel, and this is my own personal feeling here, is I feel like a lot of times we end up overselling our networks. Now, there are times when you need that, that flagship AP, you need that flagship switch, you need that high end one, the carrier grade stuff. There are times when you need that. But I feel like a lot of times we really sort of err on the side of caution and try to protect ourselves and say, "Oh, well, we don't really, we need this higher end AP because, well, just in case." And so what I want to talk about today is, do we really need that higher end AP? Do we really need all that stuff? And of course, all my sales managers and, sales VPs are probably going, listening to this and pull me out of the RUCKCast for saying this. But I believe that we can get by with a lot less. And so I want to talk about that today. And now, because I'm not a switch guy and I'm trying to limit my rant time here, I'm only going to talk about APs. And so we're going to stick with the AP side, and we're going to avoid the switch conversation, even though that's what got me onto the topic in the first place a while ago. So with that being said, I'm going to turn to, I got this idea from actually watching the Homina webinar where they were talking about doing some active learning using Homina. And so I said, I kind of like that idea. So I'm going to use Homina we're going to do some learning here today. So if you're listening to it on the audio only podcast, maybe when you get done with this, jump over to YouTube and check out the video, because this is going to work better when you can see my screen. So what I've done here in Homina is I've logged into my account and I've created a demo project. I don't have any maps, so I'm going to go grab a map real quick. So I happen to know that this third one right here, this is the map that I want. So we're going to upload this map. This is one that I used to do a demo on earlier. So I just knew it was there. So we're going to come in. We're going to check our scale. We see down here, the scale was auto-detected. When I tested it before, it was really close, so we're cool with that. We're then going to come in and we're going to draw some walls. We're going to put okay. All these look good to me. So we're just going to auto-draw our walls real quick. Might not be perfect, but for our use case today, we don't need perfect. We just need this. So now we're going to put in a scope zone. Hey, look at that. Drew it pretty quick. All right. So now we're ready to put APs on the map. But what AP do we put on the map? Now, a lot of times people will start at the high end. And they'll say, oh, yeah, I need to go with like an R770, or I need to go with the R850 or the R750 type of thing. And I actually am looking at it the opposite direction. And I say, I want to see what I can get away with some of the lower end APs. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to come in. And in fact, we're going to pick our access point here. So I'm going to come in. We're going to change it to scroll down here to a Ruckus AP. The next thing we're going to look at is I have an idea that I want the R350. And so I'm going to come down here and I'm going to find my R350. And before I click on it and say, yes, this is the one I want, I'm going to pause here a second, because what I'm going to look at is I'm going to take a look at what this pattern looks like. Now, if you don't know, you have to turn on being able to see the pattern in your settings. So if you're a new user, you have to go into your preferences and toggle the 3D antenna settings so you can come in and you can actually grab this with your mouse, with your clicker, and you can move this thing and you can take a look at it and you can go, oh, so this is what my pattern is going to look like if I look straight down on it. So this sort of, and what you'll notice on this particular one, now it's going to rotate. But we're looking at this AP pattern as if we're looking at it from the top down. So that'd be this red trace up here, this horizontal pattern. And we're looking at the 5 gigahertz band. If you watched the Homina reporting episode, you know that Homina likes to have their drop down, so we can actually toggle that and we can say, hey, well, what does it look like on 2.4? Now, this is much more of that omni or semi-hemispherical pattern that you normally see. You look at this, and as we pull it up, and then you see that little dimple. That dimple is the green and blues and yellows that we see right here. That is this dimple that we see down here in the bottom of the blue pattern. So what I like to do is I like to look at my patterns first. So this is what my R350 at 2.4, let's toggle this back to 5 because 5 is really where we like it. And we take a look at it. Now, the other thing I want to do is sometimes I debate, do I need an R350? Do I need an R550? Do I need an R650? What do I need? And so what I want to do next is I'm going to take a look, and remember what we're looking at right now is the so here's the R350, and I kind of had that little, sort of oblongish, and we're going to take a look at the R550, and we're going to take a look at this, and you can see this is still it's not an omni like you would expect to see. Now, a lot of you are probably going, oh man, that's so bad. And I look at this and I go, you know what? This is what I expect to see out of antennas, because unlike what most people are trained to see, antenna patterns are never nice and neat and clean. That's just not how they work. That's not how any of this stuff works. And so I expect to see all these little slight anomalies. And so this tells me that this is actually a true pattern, because I don't expect it to be perfectly round, perfectly all that other stuff like you designed with the solo cups, 25 years ago. I know we're not going to get a solo cup. This is more accurate. And so I kind of look at it and I go, with the exception of, not being quite oblong, they're pretty similar. And the other thing you'll notice is this datasheet gain figure right here. This is a 3 dB gain. And then we come up here to the R350. Take a look at that. Look, that is also 3 dB. So the gain is the same on both of my R350 and my R550. So let's go down here And let's take a look at the R650 right here. And what you'll notice on the R650 is, look, that was also 3 dB gain down here. If we rotate this down a little bit, this is a lot closer to the R550 that we saw. You know, it's a little more round, a little less artifacts. This is a 3x3 or 4x4. And, you know, you can see as we look on the bottom, you know, this one doesn't have that dimple. At least it's not as pronounced. It's more flat on the bottom. So maybe I want this one. And as we scroll down and we look at, say, the R750, so what I'm trying to get at is these are all about the same gain. And this one has a little bit of a pattern on the bottom. Same kind of idea. We look at it as it rotates. You know, this is a lot like the R650. And then we're going to take a look at the last one right here is the R850. Now, if I can stay on this long enough, what you're going to see is this one is really flat across the top. You see that? It is super flat. And we have a little bit of a dimple, but not much, and it's flat across the bottom. So that's what I look at, but it's still 3 dB gain. Huh. Interesting. These are all pretty much this. So from a pattern perspective, there's really not that much difference. So we're going to say, I'm going to pick the R350, and we're going to get into the next section of doing less with more. And I'm going to put an AP right here. There's my AP, right? Now, one of the things we didn't look at when we picked the model is we didn't go look at the show more. So this is mounted on the ceiling, and I can change that if I want, but we're going to leave it at this ceiling. Default height, that's fine. But we're going to take a look at this. See these transmit power figures down here? You know, where it has 6 dBm and 10 dBm. These are default, and they're the same for any AP you pick. It doesn't matter which one it is. So it's important when you pick your APs, you also need to know, well, what is the maximum transmit power for that AP? Because some APs will have a different maximum transmit power. So I can tell you all day long that the R350, instead of 10 dBm, we're going to make this 26 dBm. And we're going to make the 2.4. Wow, that really filled in my green, didn't it? We're going to make the 2.4. We're going to make that 28 dBm. So if we were to take a look at this, you know, we can go, all right, here's my AP. We're going to change it from 5 to 2.4. Man, I can cover half of this building with basically one AP. I could do the whole thing with 3 at 2.4, right? I put one here, put one over here on this other side, drop one in the middle, done, right? Gonzo, no problems. Switch back over to 5 gigahertz. You know, we take a look at this, click on that, right? Gonna need some more, but here's the dirty little secret. The R350 AP that I selected up here, it won't do 26 and 28 dBm. The tool let me put it in there, but the AP itself will not do it. You can tell your planning tool, this is what I'm going to do all day long. It just won't do it. Now, many people will tell you that, hey, we want to match the transmit power of the AP to the client device. So find out what is my least capable, most important client. Find out what its transmit power is, and that's what I'm going to set my AP to. I am not a fan of that thinking. I'm more of a fan of, I'm going to let my APs, because they have good radios and they have good antennas, I'm going to give them I'm not going to hold them back and make them act like they're a scanner or a junky phone that the IT department bought without asking anybody and said, what does it really matter? And you go, well, it's because it's got crappy Wi-Fi, antennas and radios, and you're expecting everything to run over the Wi-Fi. So I'm a fan of letting my APs do the work. Now I've gone through and I've created a table for myself, and I know about where I want to have my APs transmitting at. And in this particular case, I like to put my 2.4 gigahertz radios at 12 dBm. And I'll put my 5 gigahertz for an R350 at 18. Now this is a much more reasonable thing, because the maximum transmit power on an R350 is actually 23 dBm. So we are 5 dB down from the maximum. Now, if you're somebody who says, hey, I like to deploy all my stuff at maximum, then what you have to do is you have to come in here and you go, oh yeah, this AP is a 23 dBm. So this is really what I'm going to tell my controller to set the power at, is this number right here. So I can now look at it and I can say, hey, I have my 1 AP here and it's covering a lot. And now that I have this set up, I can come down here and I can start now designing, and I say, hey, I'm going to put an AP here. Let's put an AP down here. We'll drop an AP right here in the middle. We'll grab my map, move it over, put an AP here, put an AP here, and put an AP here. And if we look way down here, we actually have 7 access points. 7 access points have covered my entire thing. Now, the question we have then is, we now need to look at what is the capability of our AP, because at 23 dBm, well, that's actually about the same transmit power as I can get for an R550 as well. So if we were to take all of these APs and we saw, hey, we have 7 APs, we have good coverage, and we're going to select our 7 access points up here. We're going to change this. Remember, we're at 12 and 23, and we're going to come down and we're going to change that to an R550. Look, at the default power, we're not quite as good, but remember, we're at 12 and 23, and the R550 will do these transmit powers. And when we look at it, almost the same. So the question then becomes, what else do you need the AP to do? Do you need to have a second Ethernet port? Do you need to have multiple IoT? Do you need IoT at all? Do you need, but more importantly, the biggest figure we want to look at is, what are we going to ask our AP to do? And that's a capacity planning. So that's really where, people like to put dots on maps. But from a coverage perspective, I can cover anything with an R350 because, look, I can do it with 7. Now, I'd like to have it more than that. And in fact, if we come in and we do like an auto plan, and we'll leave it in R550, we'll do 12 and 23, we'll do an auto plan. We're going to see what the tool is going to tell us that it needs to do it at. Is it going to be 7? Is it going to be more? Is it going to be less? I don't know. We're going to find out. And right now, it's 8. So we added a different one. Moved the little coverage gap area, but that's fine. So, we can cover it however we want. But the one thing that most people leave out, and this is really where it's like doing more with less really comes in, is this thing called the capacity. So what we need to do is we need to come in, and we're going to turn this off so we can see this. We need to define in this area that we're trying to cover, right? What do we need? What are we trying to cover in here? How many client devices? What are these client devices? Because this is really where it's going to define what I can do. Can I do less with, or more with less? Do I really need to have that high end? Will an R850 work? Yes, it will. Do I need it? Probably not. And so this is really where it comes down to knowing and understanding your APs. So as we draw in this capacity and we say, how many, devices, are we trying to support on our 7 or 8 APs? And we're going to say, we're going to have 50 iPhones, but or let's change this to 100. Yeah, we'll say 50, because then we're going to say we're going to have 50 iPhones. Now we're going to have these same people, they're going to have some MacBooks, but we're also going to have some Windows laptops, and we're going to have 100 window laptops right here, because we have a ton of laptops. We're going to pretend they're all pre-positioned. And then we're going to have some tablets, and we're going to say we're going to have 25 tablets. So all told now, we're at 275 devices that we've added in here. into our coverage. And so when we take a look at it, we can tell about how many devices we're going to have per thing. Now let's come in here. We're going to say, here's our clients. We have 17 at 2.4 because we've set in here that we expect, the max number of client devices per radio. So you can set this. How many client devices per radio are you comfortable having on your AP? And so for me, for an R350, I might say, hey, you know what? I really kind of want those to be, we'll leave that at 10. And for an R350, I'm really kind of more comfortable in the 30 range. I don't want more than that. We don't have any 6 gigahertz, so we're just going to leave those alone right there. So, and then from our client perspective, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a mix of, we have 100 clients. I don't know why it's only showing us 100. So we're going to come back out here. And now when we take a look at we're going to see some extra numbers pop up here. We have our channels. We also have the number of clients. And so now I can take a look at it and I can say, hey, what is my dispersal? So we have 8 5 gigahertz radios. We have 5 2.4. Still think we're off on our clients because I should have more clients. Set that at 0. But now I can make the decision of, what do I feel comfortable with, on having those, all these different clients in my capacity zone. I can now get an idea of really kind of what I'm looking at, and if I go and I say, this number should really be closer to 30, and I go, man, I'm going to have, 50, 60 devices on this AP, then maybe I do need to upgrade it. Maybe I need to do something else. But using the capacity numbers to figure out, what are you really needing? What are you really doing with your APs, with your Wi-Fi coverage, is really how you figure out what type of device AP do you need to really put into place to support, those number of clients. And the other thing I'll tell you is, if you're new to this and somebody says, well, the data sheet says I can support 125, or 256 clients per radio. Don't ever look at those, because the channel can't support it. The AP might be able to support it, but the channel won't. The actual RF channel won't be able to support 256. There's just not enough airtime to do that. That is a mathematical calculation or a database number. It is not anything to do with reality. So know your APs, understand your APs. And in that way, when you go to select the AP, you're not trying to select the AP based on, how powerful the radios are. What we're doing is we're selecting the AP based on the other chips in the radio in the AP and saying, how many clients can they support? What type of workload can these, can the chips that are inside the AP support? Because that's really the defining factor of which AP we pick. And so knowing and understanding what your AP can do, and especially if you're comparing APs, knowing and understanding how those APs compare to each other is really critical when we start talking about, which AP do we pick? Do we really need to have, all of these flagship ones? Because, we just can't go wrong with buying the most expensive. Well, I hate to tell you this, but in today's day and age, sometimes you can't go wrong by buying the most expensive. And so I encourage you to put a little bit of time and effort and thought into your designs. And when you select an AP, and pick an AP that is right for the job, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what you can get away with and what you can do if you take that time to really understand, what am I asking my AP to do? What am I expecting my APs to do? What am I trying to do? And regardless of my somehow inability to figure out, how I'm going to put 275 clients into that space, maybe it's telling me it's just way too big or way too small and there's too many clients. I'll have to go figure that out. But more importantly, use these capacity zones. Use the tools that are in there. That is, because it's not just about getting a green coverage map. It's also about designing networks that are sufficient, that work, because having a whole bunch of extra capacity, processing capacity hanging from the ceiling that you're never using doesn't give you extra credit at the end of the day. So take a second, think about it, be smart about your network designs. And hopefully, by going through this exercise with me, it makes you rethink how you design your networks and how you look at what you're asking your networks to do and go, do I really, it's fun to buy all the tell everybody on social media, oh, we just bought 1,000 of the R770s. But do you really need 1,000 of the R770s? Maybe yes, maybe you do. Maybe you need a different one because it's about getting the right network for the purpose that you want it to be. I would love to sell everybody an R770, but the fact of the matter is do you really need it? We don't know. We need to have that question. We need to have that conversation. We need to take a look at what you're asking it to do. Use the tools that we have. Use the different features that are in the tools that we have, and pick an AP that will support your network. Not just is going to make my senior VP of sales happy, because they always want more. But if I can make you happy, then I'm happy. So thank you for joining me for another episode of the RUCKCast. And this is kind of fun. Hopefully I can do a little bit more. We can play around with Homina. We can do some learning and understanding how our networks work and what's the best way to make the networks work for us as opposed to us working for our network. So see you next time. Hey there. Thanks for listening. If you like the show and haven't done so, please like and subscribe. If you want to contact the show directly, you can email us at ruckcast@comscope.com. I do read those emails. To learn more about any Ruckus products or services that we've talked about on this or any other prior podcast, please check out our About section of the show or the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening.